So the first question that we're going to get started with, and any or all of you, feel free to answer. Words like community and justice are used a lot by legal organizations and movements. When you're talking about community and justice, what are you talking about?
I can go ahead and start. So for folks, again, who have gotten to know a little bit about my work, I was the prior co-director of the Washington Immigrant Solidarity Network. In my previous life, I was also the national director for the Queer Undocumented Immigrant Project. And so I've been doing, over the last 12 years, I've been organizing grassroots movements, organizations, to essentially build community power at the intersections of being LGBTQ, an immigrant, and a person of color. And over the last 12 years, I've been able to learn truly how the deportation machine has worked in our communities across the nation, and the ways that they're entangled with the criminal justice system that essentially sets up our communities to fail and to be deported and to be further criminalized for simply being and existing. And so when we talk about community and justice, particularly, especially after the Trump era, we continue to talk about deportation defense teams out in community who are essentially ensuring that community is not, that when immigration enforcement shows up in our neighborhoods, that there's a protocol and procedure to protect and defend our communities from the harassment, from the detention, and from the deportation that these agents are essentially quoted to do out there, right? The second thing that we also, when we talk about also community and justice, is to truly understand how different institutions have created barriers, physical barriers for people to be able to access justice. Not that long ago, over 200 cases were documented in Grant County where folks were trying to attend the courthouses to deal with their everyday matters, and immigration enforcement was in plain clothing, essentially kidnapping people in plain sight. We remember hearing essentially children of 13 years old calling us and letting us know that the last place where they saw their mother was at a courthouse when they were trying to go get their passport. And so for us, when we talk about community and justice, it's about having access to thriving, having access to economic opportunities, not living in fear of detention and deportation, and of course, really having community be the sole line of livelihood and defense for our communities.
I've been thinking a lot about this particular question. I think as an organization, as Lavender Project, we had traditionally done legal services, but civil legal services, and thinking in a very basic sense, making sure people had some sort of restitution and resolve for cases of discrimination was the major part of it, or the underlying piece. And there's this unfortunately, there's this connotation sort of in civil and criminal justice of like this assumption of all things equal, that if everyone gets all the resources that feel fair to them, then everything's cool. Or if someone has committed a crime and they are prosecuted under the law fairly across the board, then there's justice. And I think we have to think of something different. I think the approach that I've been just really contemplating and figuring out how we can frame our work around is the thinking about the most marginalized in our community, or historically marginalized in our community. Whether I will say that our people are not marginalized, but it's what they're trying to do to us, more so than put ourselves in the bracket of marginalization. But really, like, thinking about focusing and centering, I think centering has been a big word for me, and figuring out who are those people. And for us, and for the LGBTQ community, specifically the people that I'm around, and this changes, there might be more focus, particularly on Two-Spirit folk, on Indigenous trans people. For us, it's Black trans women and femmes. That's our primary concern. And for us, justice for those people look a little bit different. It takes a systemic approach, and how did these people end up where they are? How does it feel to give them fairness and restitution, under the law? And that's a completely different approach. So I think, it intersects with both community and justice. For us, community is a solidarity with those people who are the most marginalized. That's true community. And justice is making sure that they're uplifted, regardless of what our own concerns are for the other communities that surround them. And so it's a new definition and intersectional articulation of what community and justice means to us, is this real focus on and centering on and uplifting in a concentrated and committed and dedicated way to protecting our most vulnerable and our most precious from violence and from discrimination.
Thank you both, sisters. For me, justice, well, I can start with community. Community to me is the work that happens with folks outside of our jobs when we leave our 9 to 5. It's the work that happens in informal ways that people, most, I would say, white folks would feel uncomfortable doing, right? Whether that's showing up for your sibling who is a sex worker, a drug user, who's poor, that will take you out of your own comfort zone to be there and meet them where they are and meet their needs, right? Community is like folks who've been discarded by just society in general, and the folks we need to lift up, right? Folks such as Jaelynn covered, Black trans women and femmes, right? Folks who are who we know that if we liberate, everyone will be liberated, including our ancestors, right? And for me, justice is not rehabilitation. It's not the numerous divergent programs that gives law enforcement power to decide who's worthy of services. It isn't hate crime legislation that perpetuates more violence in our communities without ever getting to the root of the social issues that create that violence. And justice is sovereignty, right? Sovereignty over our own bodies and over the land, not seeing the land as a resource that we can manipulate and take from, but as a living thing that feeds us and keeps us safe, and that that Indigenous people have stewarded over since time immemorial, right? And have had that relationship with. And for me, justice is giving people autonomy. I personally believe that's the connecting thread between all of our movements is autonomy, that folks know what they need to take care of themselves, folks know what they need to keep their community safe. And as legal organizations or folks in the legal system, y'all need to trust that. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Not only do you need to trust it, you need to listen and take in this wisdom and knowledge. Thank you so much for all that you've shared. And yes, trans folks have been here since time immemorial across the world. And unfortunately, colonization, genocide, et cetera, has tried to change that narrative, but it's wonderful seeing that strength and knowledge and ancestral wisdom coming back. So another thing that I think folks can really learn from BIPOC trans folks is, what is community care and how do you practice it in your work?
I can start since I went last time. For me, community care it's something that's been, has many names, right? Without any depth or real relationship building involved. it has a name such as mutual aid. But we know that Black and brown, queer, and trans folks have been doing community care without having to call it community care. It was just showing up for the people that you love, for the people in your community. And when I think about the pandemic and seeing how so many organizations who told us, sorry, we can't move money to individuals to cover their basic needs because it's in the grant, it's written, it's restricted. And to see those organizations just dole out money like that wasn't the case. It was heartbreaking because it took a pandemic for y'all to move money to individuals. Hearing from organizers such as Jaelynn, Monserrat, and a lot of brilliant organizers on the ground saying that, you know, people can't show up for the work to move what we need to move in movements when people are worried about basic needs. They're worried about housing. They're worried about just the bare minimum, right? And to see that happen over the course of the pandemic, hopefully it stays that way after, is enlightening, and how our movements continue to lack access to resources and in taking care of our people. So community care for me is making sure that there's money available to pay people to do the work, so that they're not having to work several jobs or not having to sacrifice their livelihood in order to show up, which we've always done. We've always done this work for free, and we're not doing it for free anymore. And community care for me looks like meeting people where they are and understanding that I have a positional power, and I'm honored to do this work and get paid for it. But it looks like showing up for sex workers, whether that's providing them with resources to cover their basic needs, housing, because we know sex workers are still getting evicted throughout the pandemic, regardless of a moratorium. We know that drug users are being, and houseless folks are being served by governments and organizations that have no intention of meeting their needs, and are more focused on getting them well, and without getting to the shame, to the stigma that folks have to deal with, right? And getting to their mental health needs. And it's, folks call it harm reduction, but you know, Black and brown, queer and trans folks have been doing that work without calling it community care or harm reduction. We've always showed up for each other because we know we have deep love and care for one another, and that's what it takes to truly liberate our communities and truly move the work forward. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think for what's coming to mind for community care is, you know, the memory that comes to my mind is being 7 years old, living in a garage with my immigrant mother who worked at a sweatshop, and hosting 3 other uncles in the same garage with us, because we were essentially like a portal for them to be able to live and be able to have money to fund their families back in Mexico, right? That we've practiced community care since the get-go. We have survived crises even before this global pandemic. And so I think for a minute there, when this global pandemic hit, of course, our communities were going to be hit the hardest. But something that was automatically already ingrained in how we survive was leaning on each other, right? That's literally how we survive. Over the years, our ancestors have taught us that, right? That's why we're here in this moment. And so, yeah, I mean, I think especially during this global pandemic, like mutual aid has already been discussed. One of the projects that I was able to work on was essentially create a fund for our undocumented communities, because folks were going to be left out of most safety net programs safety net programs and unable to access things as simple as food banks, right? Because of immigration status or social security's numbers being required. And so part of the work that we did over the last couple of years has been ensuring that no one is left behind during a global crisis, and especially when there's a need to really show up for one another during a global pandemic. And so I think one of the amazing things that we were able to do during this fund that we were able to get out to community was also to introduce, one of the most exciting parts was actually to introduce the word transgender to my immigrant community. Over 150,000 people were introduced to this word. I was asking folks as we were helping them access these funds, 70-year-old undocumented tios who were like, oh, are you transgender? And folks, would be introduced to this term. And it was exciting to really merge community there, right? To understand that we continue to exist in undocumented communities, and for our immigrant community to really stand in solidarity with our transgender community. And so, again, going back into community care, we've practiced that since our survival, and we continue to do that in every program that we incorporate. And so, yes, transgénero. So, I think going back into ensuring that we continue to have access to resources is one of the major things that so that our communities can essentially set themselves up to thrive and to continue thriving as we have always done, even during crisis.
The image in my head for some reason, let's see if I can make this connection, but it's from Morrison's Beloved, and Setha, the character, having gone through all of this trauma, having even acted out from the trauma in certain ways that the community did not understand, and had been temporarily marginalized, temporarily pushed out because of what she was going through her pain that had been inflicted on her by society, right, and caused her to take certain actions. At some point in the novel, the entire community of Black women realized that she's just a basic thing that turned their hearts was that she was hungry and her kids were hungry and they didn't have food. And the moment they found that out, they snapped, they turned, and they were like, let's get together. The entire community got together. They brought over food, they brought over prayer, they brought over spirituality. They worked to, deliver her from really the trauma that had been inflicted on her together. And I think in Black community, that embodies, the character of community care that I was used to growing up, but that has slowly died away culturally, that even in many ways I'm not used to anymore. But that was what my grandmothers had, and my great grands and my aunts, they still had that. They were holding, they would say that, yet holding on to it. And when it came to us as trans and queer people, that was not extended to us. I mean, I think in the past and in history, yes. And there had always been like these cultural mores that we were always willing to put aside for community care reasons. But I think the last holders of the tradition are Black trans people. You think about, it's cliche now, but you think about the ballroom scene and what it truly is and what it always has been. It's that model of, the community in Ohio around Setha and taking care of the family, these women coming out and just putting aside all of their differences to get it done and to deliver them from trauma and to protect them from harm. That's what the Black trans community did in the ballroom scene, because nobody else was doing that for them. So they created these families, even those families who weren't in balls, there were families who were not involved in ballroom at all, that you had these protected families of care for our people. And I think we're the last holders of that community of care that from the African-American tradition, one of the last holders of it. I think I can say that. I think I'm authorized to say that, and that's my experience. And that's a model. And I think it's also a model that we can look at as organizers and service providers and organizations, instead of you know, coming from white ways of knowing and being and mutual care rooted in capitalism and all of those things that have been spoken of here. We could be thinking about what does that model look like and how could we transfer that model into how we actually doing our work and our services. Yeah.
Thank you so much. So much trauma, but also wisdom, having gone through generations of what Black and Brown people have had to do, especially on stolen land of people who should not be enforcing rules on stolen land. But thank you so much. So as has been touched on a bit, Black trans women, if we liberate them, if we uplift them, if we give them the place that they should be, as Jaelynn mentioned, it'll liberate us all. And unfortunately, the reality that we're in today is that Black trans women are particularly at risk of individual and systemic violence. How do we seek justice for Black trans women without further criminalizing Black people? Jaelynn, if you could start maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a difficult question and one that we all have to wrestle with. You know, we spoke a little bit about the sort of criminalization, criminal justice approach, the traditional one. And I think oftentimes when folks hear that we're doing, I don't even like using the word, but anti-violence work, the immediate reaction for people who want to help are like, okay, well, let's look at policy and legislation and figure out how we can protect folk, when in reality, it doesn't protect anyone. The Violence Against Women Act has not protected women. And it certainly hasn't protected Black trans women. And I think there was no way have they been considering or even now considering that act should also apply to trans women. But I don't want it to apply because it's not helpful at all. And, you know, there's this complication that, you know, I don't want to get into here because it's mixed crowd, but the complication of, you know, if the violence is happening in our community, from within our community of other people that look like us, what do we do? You know, first of all, to make that too public, it makes me really nervous and my skin crawl to even say that in this audience because, you know, I think it comes with connotations of Black on Black crime and all of, you know, that other BS when there's no real Black on Black crime. It's white system against Black people crime that manifests in the community in a certain way. And that's the secondary, the systemic approach is the thing that we need when we're thinking about how do we protect Black trans women, because if we just approach it from what seems like the obvious, okay, here is this intimate partner or client violence that's happening, and here's this, you know, say it's someone of the same identity, Black cis man with a Black trans woman or femme, you know, it would seem obvious that there's a problem in the Black community, and it's not. There's not a problem in the Black community. And then if you take a criminalization approach, you say, well, or criminal justice approach, well, you know, we need to increase or we need to build more ways that say, you know, like, look, it's not okay to hurt, you know, Black trans women. And then if you do, you're going to go to prison or be executed and face all of the X, Y, and Z, right? That's not the solution either. You know, the solution to heal Black trans women is not to incarcerate further and enslave, really, if we want to be real about it, Black men and Black cis men. That's just simply not the solution at all. It would further destroy our community and further marginalize Black trans women. So having said all that, I don't know. I mean, I know it's a community-based approach. I know it's systemic. I know it's disrupting those systems that lead to this, including the criminalization of sex work. All of those pieces, right, are there that we need to be thinking about what's around the issue, what's outside of the issue, and take a larger perspective. But I don't know what the magic solution is. I simply don't. I do know it's not in criminal justice. I do know that's not it, but there's some community response, there's some systemic disruption that needs to happen.
Thank you so much, Jaelynn. And I'm going to pause just for a moment. Unfortunately, Monse has to leave us, but thank you so much, Monse. And we will be continuing
I love you, sis.
on. Yes.
Guess it's just us. Yeah, like Jaelynn said, that's a loaded question, because violence looks for Black trans folks, Black trans women and femmes, violence is unique, right, to that community who faces trans misogynoir, who faces a lot of intimate partner violence, right? And when it comes to comes to the violence against Black trans women and femmes, and just seeing the increase in murders and inhumane treatment of Black trans folks, that violence comes from, is like baked into the system, right? We have to address not only just individual violence, systemic violence, but also the cultural transphobia that helps perpetuate that violence, right? When we think about the way Black trans women are talked about in the media, are listed in just newspapers, they are misgendered, they don't recognize their names or genders or their humanity, right? And a lot of those deaths go unreported. And so that violence we need to define that violence broader for Black trans women and femmes. And when I think about solutions, I have behind me the wrong way, Trans Agenda for Liberation. And it's something that I've been honored to be a part of, and to, although at the tail end, seeing how this work has been moving for the past 5+ years, and having different iterations, and including the brilliance of many different Black trans women and femmes nationally and locally, who've done this work and who bring so much knowledge and expertise around the solutions that need to liberate our movements. So I would have folks go to the Trans Agenda for Liberation through Transgender Law Center, and see the work that's been done. That includes making sure that Black trans folks are at the forefront of migrant freedom movements, right? A lot of times those movements are kept separate, and they're kept separate for a reason, because it doesn't do opposition any good for those movements to unite. So Indigenous folks are kept separate from Black folks, and we don't often honor the indigeneity of Black folks, right? When Black folks are Indigenous, even though in this country, you know, descendants of stolen people have had that connection severed. We need to honor that Black folks are Indigenous, right? And that both movements need to center each other not at the expense of one another. Other solutions include ending the criminalization of self-defense, right? When Black trans women and femmes are facing violence and survive, the system puts them in prisons, and without fighting for their rights of having to defend themselves. Also ending the trans panic. There are still over 20 states across the country that haven't banned the trans panic. Focusing on legislation that such as like prostitution loitering, which is really walking while trans, and ending programs such as LEAD, which is a divergent program that started here, was piloted here in Seattle, and is now being used across the country as a positive form of enforcement by our communities, and who are misinformed that these programs don't heal our communities. They don't provide real solutions, and they just continue the violence. These continue to give law enforcement more power to and more access to services. I would say listening to leaders like Jaelynn and many other Black trans folks, because they have those solutions, although they may be unique to the region or that they're from, that those solutions are important, right? And they are doing the work on the ground, so they have those solutions. I would also say decriminalizing sex work. We know that sex work is often conflated with sex trafficking under the guise of, and sex trafficking is pushing out work under the guise of protecting women and children, just in the same way that anti-trans bathroom bills were put out there to protect women and children. Women don't need protection. They can protect themselves. Give women autonomy and agency to tell us how they want to be protected. And so decriminalizing sex work, because we know that the sex trafficking movement and all of these laws around ending sex trafficking is rooted in transphobia. And folks reading on that history, we know that that's where it's rooted. When people focus on sex trafficking without having to focus on labor trafficking, all of the other ways people are being trafficked, yet they focus on sex work, it does the work of the service, and it takes away from all of the ways that people are being trafficked. And in Washington, people are being trafficked for their labor. People have been working, putting in their labor in Yakima for more than 10 years without any pay, and are basically hostages. So I would say, if you are someone who is anti-sex trafficking, understand that sex workers are anti-sex trafficking, and try to dig deeper to see that there are other ways people are being trafficked more than just sex trafficking, and that sex workers, if we decriminalize sex work, it's easier for us to report incidents of sex trafficking, and when we're driven further underground, that creates more violence, not just for us as sex workers, but for folks who are being trafficked.
I want to jump back in. I think all of those pieces that Agaiotupu have laid out are agenda pieces that needed to be added to the list. I think for some of them, like for example, the Trans-Panic Defense, I think that starts getting into the heart of the issue. I think the Trans Agenda for Liberation, thank you so much for lifting that up. It really has been a guiding force personally for me in thinking about organizing work. One of those things is, trans people deserving a home, and especially Black trans women. We have been really looking at that guiding document and figuring out what is the core need right now. Like, I really don't know what the fundamental solution is to resolve the problem is systemically. I do think that every single one of these items that were brought up need to be addressed. I think for us, there's a prioritization for housing first as a first step to jump into remedying the situation. So making sure that Black trans people have a place that is their own, that has their own bathroom, that they can be protected, that they can be safe, that they can lock the door, and that they have access, right? And so that for us has been an approach. And it's really interesting. If you're really committed to, we're a civil legal organization, right? Lavender Rights Project, and we're now talking about and in the middle of working on housing and a housing project, and it feels like a mission drift to some extent, but it's not. It's because we're really contemplating this question that's being brought up of how do we actually provide true justice for Black trans people, and following the leadership of Black trans people and all of those people, like I said, who have worked on this trans agenda of liberation and et cetera, who told us that like Black trans people leading and Black trans people in housing, right? And Black trans people having access to citizenship and law and rights and all of those things, like those are the priorities for us. And so if that's the case, and if we truly want justice, and that's what they're telling us what we need to do, what do we as an organization do? So we said, you know what, if true justice is this wraparound approach that's not just about right? Making sure that we give some lawsuits for some Black people and get them settlements, that we're actually building a housing, that we're working on a housing project for them to protect them, building out a protected community for them so that we can start building out some of these other people, putting Black trans people in leadership in the organization and in our organizing, right? So we had to shift our entire mindset, and that's true following. We had to actually follow what they have told us, what this agenda for liberation is telling us, what Black trans leadership is telling us across the country, what's needed, versus stuck in what what we think our typical mission is, or what we think our legal training is.
Thank you so much. And I really appreciate how, yeah, sometimes there aren't answers, but at least that we're asking the questions and we're in community contemplating next steps and directions and different ways of thinking. It is so great. So we've gotten a question from the audience that kind of builds further on what we've been talking about. I think I put this question, well, not if that did anything, but I'll read the question. Thank you for this. I was in the middle of typing a question about intimate partner violence when you asked the question. What is your thinking about the use of civil protection orders? What would you like lawyers who work in this field to think about in terms of the impact on Black trans women of that civil system?
Can this anonymous attendee offer some more fullness?
Yeah, feel free to, and it's a little legalese, so as a paralegal, I'm happy to.
I mean,
it's a little.
I mean, I think access to protection orders, it's a difficult question, right? Because fundamentally built in protection order is the right to call, right, the police to enforce your protection order. And policing is highly problematic. I don't think it has much use in the Black trans community. I will not say that we need to have full access to whatever remedy we need to protect ourselves. Having said that, I have not seen that it has been the most useful in our community. I am not seeing, in all honesty, many of our clients pursuing that route as Black trans people, just because they don't want to interact with the police. Rates of violence against Black trans people, including in the city of Seattle, and assault of Black trans people by the hands of police are ridiculous and astronomical. And so we don't actually trust the police to enforce our protection. I think a community solution for protection is where it's at. That's where it's at for us. How do, I think having access to it if a client comes to you and absolutely making sure that they have access, making sure that the court understands that they have the same protection that any femme person would have under a civil protection order. However, what can we do to think about protecting folks who are vulnerable to or the victims of intimate partner violence that does not involve calling the popo to get involved and to completely mess up the situation?
Yeah, I would say it shouldn't be the solution, I guess the answer for one size fits all solution, right? For folks who want that protection, they can choose to do so, but it isn't the answer to protecting Black trans folks, right? In general, we know that legislation and laws that are in place don't always keep us safe because, like Jaelynn said, isn't enforced, and also our relationships to law enforcement hasn't been a relationship that we trust, or it doesn't exist, or it isn't a relationship that we trust in, because we're further criminalized. Black trans women are further criminalized and also extorted, right? When it comes to engaging with police, especially around being exploited sexually. And we need to focus on the facts that legislation and laws don't always keep us safe, and that shifting culture, shifting culture by changing the way folks view and humanize Black trans people and trans people in general, will create safety in tandem with the work that needs to be done around changing legislation. I hope that offers an answer to your question.
And to build a little more and to further educate the attorneys in the room if they don't already know, yes, it is an option. And as Agaiotupu and Jaelynn said, it's good to have options. So there's criminal orders, like you call the police, and then the criminal justice system takes over. The civil order is slightly different, but as Jaelynn mentioned, that can also still end up in police and criminal activity, even if the person who got the protection order isn't reporting it. A neighbor could report a violation of a protection order. The first 3 times, I believe it is a misdemeanor. The 4th time, it's a felony. And that could be like in one day, someone could get up to like multiple felonies, if they are doing things and it's reported. Again, especially in our BIPOC trans communities, literally it could, like, we call the police, that could end up in any one of us, including ourselves, dying, literally. And there are yet other options. I work for Kila Foundation. We're working on a survivor's guide for community, which will be inclusive of trans folks. It's being written by one of my colleagues who's Black and trans, and I'm contributing some. I'm working on a housing guide for community that'll be out soon too. In housing, for example, a landlord can evict someone who's harming someone due to a criminal protection order, a civil protection order, or a letter from like a third party, such as API Chaya, Utopia, Lavender Rights, that like states that there has been some violence, some harm, some threat of harm. So we don't actually need the legal system to do what's needed sometimes. And definitely there's options, but there's options outside the traditional legal system. And that's something like at Kila, we really try to empower community with knowing all their various options, and that may not be running to court, especially when the courts have been such an oppressive, transphobic place for many of us. And at the end of the day, a piece of paper signed by a judge protects no one.
Thank you for that nuance. I'm not an attorney, by the way. I'm just leading a legal organization. So having some of the nuance on what our attorneys actually do is really nice. And I think, it speaks to the same issue. This is a good place to think about the Black Lives Matter movement, specifically the summer of 2020. And this new thought about how we are handling, I'm not advocating one way or the other necessarily in this space, but thinking about defund the police and the intersectional needs of Black folk, and how really the Black Lives Matter movement is absolutely necessary, and why Black trans lives matter movement is critical to that movement, because this is one of those intersecting pieces. Our relationship with policing, I spoke about is just, it's absolutely terrible. However, this risk of misdemeanors and felonies for others in the Black community just doesn't work. We don't trust the criminal justice system to actually resolve issues fairly for other Black people. And so, oftentimes, sexual assault, molestation is underreported anecdotally, and I've seen data in our community for this very reason, because we don't feel like that we have to make the decision as if we're judges for things that have been done against us, right, of whether or not an action is worth a death sentence. And oftentimes prison or being caught up in the criminal justice system for Black people, especially Black men, and definitely Black trans women, is a death sentence. And so, you know, to call the police is to act like judge and jury for us and declare a death sentence on a person. And honestly, with everything that happens to us, if it's another Black person, we often have to go through this discernment process about, like, is this actually worth this person's death, right? And so what it means is there's just no real solution in the court for us at all in terms of getting transformative real justice for harm perpetuated against us for people who might look like us. So that's some of the complexity. And I think that that's some of the subtlety around why policing itself is not working in our community, why especially it's not working in the Black trans community, and why the sort of criminal justice system falls apart in the face of our culture. And so, yeah, but thank you for some of that, the subtlety and your explanation of that.
Yeah, adding to that nuance, I would say that poverty, right, is also a factor when it comes to Black trans folks attempting to access legal services and attempting to access protection from the law. And when folks do call the police are ill prepared to deal with Black trans folks who may have a disability or who just unprepared because they do not understand the lived experiences of BIPOC people in general, right? And they're operating from a criminal punishment mentality, right? Instead of like showing up to actually help the person that they're showing up for, right? And the community solutions looks like a separate team, right? A team that has community folks who are who can address those needs, such as mental health, who can address and understand that BIPOC folks who may be poor don't have access to legal services and are often punished because they're poor and forced to take guilty pleas, right? Which leads them into imprisonment. So I would say addressing poverty as thinking about the different ways folks are criminalized just beyond their BIPOC experience or their Black experience. That's compounded under that.
One more quick thing I think that brought up what you were saying is that I think we need to pay attention to what's happening in the city of Seattle around, you know, King County Equity Now and Black Lives Matter, King County, Seattle, King County, Minneapolis, and other areas where they're actually coming up with community-based solutions that actually can work in these particular areas. What's really important, however, is that there is Black trans leadership, that there is trans leadership in that for the very reason that Agaiotupu just mentioned, is that we actually have very trans-specific needs that aren't necessarily met just by, right, having community-based protection. It could be the same, or it could even be worse, unless from the very beginning in this organizing strategies, we start coming up with solutions for trans folk from the leadership of trans people. But I think it's really important we start looking at that, because those promise, there's a big promise in that for actual real solutions for justice and safety and protection and community responses that are being built in these various cities.
Thank you so much. Yes, if we said our Black trans women, then we can go from there, meeting everyone's needs. And other great wisdom you've shared. Another question, pivoting, but just slightly, what kind of new or non-traditional ways would you like legal services organizations to partner with communities? What must organizations do to be accountable in those partnerships? And we're at like 6 minutes. And I also do recognize we've got some great questions too, but trying to get to as much as we can.
I can start because yes, this is something I'm very, if you are, I would say non-traditional ways, if your intentions are to go after the shiny shit that builds your legacy and the legacy of your organization, then I would say you're not worthy of our partnerships, right? A lot of times we show up in coalition and we have agreements to keep each other accountable, and legal orgs want to be a part of the table without having any real accountability. And I want to specifically name groups like ACLU, who have so much power and so much access, yet they show up to the table and they don't commit to being accountable. They do want access to the different strategies that people on the ground have without and then take that to build their legacy. And that legacy and those strategies are half-assed, right? It doesn't include the work that's that's happening on the ground. And it's a lot of it is in campaign brain, right? Which is let's get this passed. Let's, for the benefit of one person or a small group of people without understanding that the implications on the rest of the population is long lasting. And we're having to go back after campaigns and to fix those messes when we don't put out strategies that take into consideration how it's going to impact the next 7 generations. Those are partnerships we're not interested in. Partnerships we want is listening to us, right? We're the folks who are on the ground with community. We are community, and we know what the needs are for community. I would say have like an analysis when doing this work, right? Build your analysis, educate yourself, understand how deeply rooted institutional racism is, and that you operate and come from that system, and that you need to decolonize your mind and putting out real solutions and that are coming from community to do this work. So I would say like true partnership is y'all showing up as co-conspirators, and that and understanding your positional power within that relationship.
I'm with you, and yeah, for the call out. I'll say the first is absolutely get your shit together. And I'm not saying take 5 years of saying we're working on our white fragility while we do nothing. Like, that's not the solution at all. Quickly get your stuff together, right? And then figure out where you're holding privilege, how your institution is perpetuating harm, where you're not really working in community. And I think I'm just gonna, reflect what was already said. Oftentimes, for example, in policymaking, we're approached by organizations, larger, powerful organizations with more access to legislation and legislators for legal policymakers, right? We're approached at the very end and say, oh, we forgot the trans and the Black. Can you just add us a line? Can you make us feel better about it? And that's not a solution, because the whole bill doesn't work at all for the community. You didn't include us from the very beginning. You didn't provide funding for us to be involved in the work. You didn't trust our wisdom in the process of the work. Your whole institution and the way you've set up policymaking has excluded us. And that thing needs to be revisited. Absolutely needs to be revisited. And on impact litigation, it's the exact same. Who's involved from the very beginning in your cases to see whether or not, and it might not be obvious. You might be working with a white client who is queer, and it may not be obvious that there's intersection and impact on the Black trans community, but who are you consulting with from the very beginning? This is this piece where I was talking about the centering. When you take on something, you first ask yourself a question about how does this impact Black trans women, especially with something like impact litigation. You think about that's around queer and trans services. You think about how does this impact Black trans women? How does our approach impact? How does our taking this case impact? What solutions do we need that might be slightly different with that consideration? And consult with them and pay them for that consultation. And if you don't have the relationships for the consultation or the relationships to actually get advice from them, build those relationships, figure out why you're so excluded from Black community and Black trans community, and fix that too.
I want to add to that really, like, imagine if we all, not just organizers, but also legal folks, if we all thought about if every decision we made going forward centered Black trans women and femmes, the work would move a lot quicker. Right. So I want to +1 what Jaelynn said, to keep that at the back of your mind, even when you're helping one person. consider how that's going to impact the rest of the community.
Thank you so much. Think we're going to be ending, but amazing wisdom. Thank you so much.
It is 11 a.m. now. So unfortunately, we are at time. I did want to thank our panelists for sharing their wisdom, for affirming that we need to focus on who is the most harmed and who has been doing this work for generations, and to not co-opt these movements. I know there were some questions in the Q&A that we didn't get to. Jesse did put his email in the chat, but I wanted to say it out loud. So feel free to email him to further connect. It is Jesse, Jesse, at qlawfoundation.org, QLAW foundation.org. And thank you all again for joining us. I hope you enjoy the rest of your Friday. I hope you stay hydrated and cool and enjoy the last hour or two of the conference. Thank you all.
Dominique, I'm curious, like, I know if this was like in person, right, there would be more space and time to field these questions and to connect with people. And so, but I don't know how, like, it seems pretty rigid, the timeline, but I would love to continue to work with folks and to educate folks, right? Not too much, do your own work too, but I would love to share my information. I know Jaelynn does a lot of great work around supporting Black trans folks there. So if some space can be provided for that, it'd be great.
Happy to too.
Yeah, I think that would be great if you all could share your information.
Okay. Sorry, Dominique. So folks can reach me at Agaiotupu at Pride Foundation. It's also on the program, it's just my first name at Pride Foundation. And yeah, I would love to connect with folks, especially around the work we're doing to decriminalize sex work at the state level, which it will be a 2-year campaign in building community and base building, and while focusing on community in general.
Awesome, thank you all. I do want to affirm what you said, and that the contact emails are in the chat. I'm hoping people are writing them down. They're also on the agenda for this conference. But if you reach out to WISPA staff or to Jesse or to anyone, we can definitely get you connected so we can continue these partnerships and these conversations.
Definitely, my email is also accessible at QLaw Foundation staff, and there's a link that has my email. Happy to connect folks.
Okay, thank you, everyone.
Thanks, y'all. Take care.